It was on a morning of soft and uncertain rain, when the windows of Baker Street wore a pale mist upon their panes, and the fire had not yet decided whether to glow or merely to breathe, that the affair first came quietly into our lives. London seemed half awake. The wheels in the street below passed with a muffled sound. The cry of the newsboy drifted upward and thinned into the weather. In our sitting room, with its familiar disorder of journals, chemical bottles, unanswered letters, and violin music scattered in loose companionship, all things appeared as they so often did when Holmes had not slept enough, and I had slept just enough to mistake the day for a peaceful one. He lay long and angular in his chair by the hearth, one hand hanging loose, the other resting near the bowl of his pipe, while a faint line of smoke wandered toward the ceiling. There are men who appear idle only when they are most alive within. Holmes was one of those. A stranger, seeing him thus, might have thought him detached from the world. I, who had observed him through many moods and many cases, knew better than to trust the stillness of his body over the activity of his mind. For my own part, I had settled with the newspaper and a cup of coffee gone pleasantly lukewarm. The articles of the morning were of the usual type: parliamentary murmurs, foreign unease, a theft in Kensington, and one tedious account of a society wedding so over-described that it had exhausted my sympathy by the third paragraph. Mrs. Hudson had lately removed the breakfast tray, though not without that look of tolerant reproach which Holmes's habits so regularly earn. The room, relieved of clatter, seemed to sink again into quiet, and I had just reached the conclusion that the rain would continue all day when Holmes lifted an envelope from the side table and broke the seal. The movement was so sudden, and his attention so complete, that I lowered my paper at once. "A foreign hand," said he. The envelope, which I had scarcely noticed before, bore indeed a continental stamp. He read the contents in a swift glance, then passed the message to me without comment. It was brief, so brief, in fact, that its urgency seemed all the sharper for its restraint. A Parisian inspector requested Holmes's immediate presence in connection with the death of a painter of some distinction. The circumstances were peculiar. Foul play had been whispered, but not yet proved. The matter required discretion, intelligence, and speed. I read it twice before returning it. "A painter," said I. "That is a new species of summons." "Not entirely," Holmes replied. "Crime, my dear Watson, is fond of all professions, but it chooses its costume according to the neighborhood. In Whitechapel it may wear rags. In the city it wears respectability. In artistic circles it develops taste." The shadow of a smile touched his mouth. He rose then and crossed to the window, drawing the curtain a fraction wider with those long, nervous fingers of his. Outside, the street shone softly beneath the drizzle, the lamps not yet needed and yet not wholly relinquished by the hour. "Paris," he murmured. "A dead painter, a reluctant inspector, and a request sent over the channel in haste. It promises texture, if nothing else." I asked whether he meant to go, though I knew from the brightness that had already entered his eyes that the matter was settled. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned back toward the fire, and for a moment his expression took on that inward look I had often seen when several lines of possibility were arranging themselves before him. "A man may be killed for money," said he. "That is common. He may be killed for revenge. That is older still. But to be called away in pursuit of a dead artist suggests one of the more refined miseries: envy, reputation, imitation, perhaps even beauty itself. Those are motives of a quieter kind. Yet they have ruined as many lives as greed." His words, spoken in that level tone which made even speculation sound like recollection, left upon the air an impression both curious and faintly melancholy. Outside, the rain slid slowly down the glass. The room felt smaller and warmer because of it. And yet Paris, with all its distance and promise of strangeness, had already entered between the walls. I made some practical remark about trains and luggage. Holmes waved it aside for the moment, then stooped to knock ash from his pipe. "We shall go tonight," said he. "The sooner the better. Take your medical bag. I advise also a notebook, though perhaps not too hopeful a one. French officialdom admires secrecy, the way actors admire mirrors." At that instant, there came a knock, and Lestrade entered upon some unrelated business, which he quickly perceived would not prosper in the face of a continental distraction. There passed between him and Holmes a brief exchange of irony, half good-humored, half competitive, such as long acquaintance had rendered easy. When he had gone, the room seemed to settle once more. Holmes gathered the telegram, slipped it into his casebook, and stood with his back to the mantel. The fire lit one side of his face, and left the other in that fine grey tone which London mornings lend to everything. "It is curious," said he softly, almost as if to himself, "how often the most dangerous thing in a room is the object everyone has agreed to call harmless." He said no more then, yet I felt in the remark the first movement of the case, the first soft opening of a door. All that day, London continued with its rain, its cabs, its newspapers, its damp pavements, and indifferent multitudes. But for Holmes and me, the shape of the hours had changed. Before evening, the trunk was strapped, the timetable consulted, our brief instructions given to Mrs. Hudson, and the quiet enclosure of Baker Street prepared for temporary absence. When at last we left the house and stepped into the fine, cold drizzle, the city seemed to withdraw a little behind its own weather, as if permitting us to pass from one atmosphere into another. Holmes raised his collar, turned once toward the blurred lamps at the end of the street, and set off at his long, deliberate pace. I followed, carrying my bag and wondering, not for the first time, by what hidden route a human life may travel from talent into danger, and how a dead man in a Paris studio had already begun, without speech or movement, to draw us out of London and into his silence. Our departure from England was made under a sky no clearer than the one that had accompanied the telegram. The station lamps shone upon Whetstone. Porters moved in red flashes through steam. A whistle sounded, lonely and practical at once, and the train bore us out through districts whose lights thinned gradually into darkness. Holmes spoke little. When he is thinking, in earnest conversation becomes for him a kind of tax, and friendship learns, if it is wise, to lower its voice and sit quietly beside the process. I have always found a night journey by rail conducive to a strange softness of mind. The body submits to motion, the eyes surrender the scenery, and attend instead to reflections half seen in the window glass. Even the noises of travel, the measured beat beneath the carriage, the rattle at a junction, the distant call on a platform seem after a while to join in one patient rhythm. Holmes sat opposite me, his hat tilted low, his profile lean against the dim compartment lamp. Now and then he removed from his pocket the telegram and read it again. Not, I think, because it contained anything further to be learned, but because some phrase in it had already joined itself to other thoughts, not yet fit to be spoken. Near midnight, we reached the coast and transferred to the boat. The sea received us in darkness, not rough enough to inspire fear, but restless enough to remind one that all crossings are acts of faith in invisible shores. The deck was slick beneath the feet. Wind moved in long, cold streams between the funnels. Beyond the rail, the water heaved and fell without color, though at intervals a stretch of it caught some diluted glimmer and shone briefly like metal before sinking again into obscurity. Holmes, who was more wakeful on the deck than he had been in the train, stood near the stern and looked not at the sea immediately below us, but far out where the horizon had dissolved into cloud. "You anticipate difficulty?" I asked, drawing my coat close against the air. "My dear Watson," said he, "difficulty is a word used by those who hope to master a matter by effort alone. The more curious cases depend less upon labor than upon arrangement. One must first discover how the pieces prefer to sit. Only then can one know which of them has been set upside down. That is not an answer. It is the answer most available until Paris offers us more. He relented a little after that, and admitted that the affair interested him precisely because it appeared, from the little we knew, to have advanced under cover of ordinary things. No broken lock, no witness to violence, no theatrical token of crime. It is easy, Holmes observed, to investigate what announces itself loudly. The subtler danger lies in what passes under a familiar name and is therefore left unexamined. A household object, a professional tool, a habit, a gesture. Men are betrayed less often by what they fear than by what they have ceased to notice. There was something in the sea air, or perhaps in the lateness of the hour, that made even such remarks seem less severe than thoughtful. The boat moved with a heavy persistence through the dark. Below, from some interior saloon, came the clink of glass and the murmur of sleepy travelers. A woman laughed once and stopped. A door banged. Then the wind resumed possession of the vessel, and all else was diminished by it. Toward dawn, the line between sea and sky grew less absolute. A grayness appeared that was not yet light. Then a broader pallor spread behind the clouds, and at last the coast emerged, not dramatically, but by degrees, as if the world had been drawing itself quietly in charcoal, and was now beginning to admit shape. Holmes opened his eyes and followed my gaze. "There," said he. "Another nation, another vanity. You are severe upon Paris before setting foot in it." "On the contrary, I admire Paris immensely. It has perfected the art of seeming transparent while remaining entirely composed of curtain." When at length the outskirts of Paris began to gather around us, I saw in succession factory roofs, chimneys, washing lines, church spires, narrow courts, and then broader streets, where the city seemed to stretch and contradict itself at every turn. There is in Paris a constant oscillation between elegance and neglect, display and fatigue. Even under a pale sky, one senses in it both performance and weariness. Holmes noticed the same and appeared pleased. "A useful city," said he. "It leaves more things half hidden than hidden." We changed vehicles once more, and as we climbed gradually toward the quarter where our dead painter had lived and worked, the streets narrowed, the houses leaned nearer, the shop signs became more intimate, and one felt the breath of another sort of existence altogether. Here there were cafes, with windows filmed by steam, laundry strung between upper stories, posters peeling from walls, and the persistent movement of men and women who looked as though sleep and ambition had come to some uneasy compromise in them years before. The case, which in Baker Street had been no more than an urgent message, now possessed streets, weather, roofs, and windows. It had acquired air. It had entered the senses before it had entered the mind. And as our carriage climbed into that gray quarter of artists and cheap lodgings, I had the distinct impression that whatever waited for us above was not merely a fact to be uncovered, but an atmosphere already prepared, already holding within it the quiet stain of something wrong. Our carriage stopped before a weathered house with tall upper windows and a door whose paint had suffered from both rain and years. There we were met by the inspector who had summoned Holmes. He was a spare, dark man of perhaps 45, well kept, watchful, and inclined, as I judged at once, to regard assistance from abroad as a necessity best handled in the tone of a temporary inconvenience. His courtesy was not insincere, but it had in it the delicate stiffness of professional pride. Holmes met him with that exact mixture of civility and detachment which has so often enabled him to disarm resistance without seeming to challenge it. They exchanged the requisite formalities. The inspector repeated that the case was unusual. He spoke of rumors among artists, of unfortunate publicity, of a dead painter whose admirers demanded murder, while the available facts suggested perhaps only seizure, weakness, or some hidden illness. Holmes listened with his head a little inclined, one hand in his coat, and said merely that facts were shy creatures best approached before they had been named too confidently. We entered and mounted a staircase so narrow that our shoulders nearly brushed the walls. The boards complained beneath our feet, a faint odor of stale tobacco. Damp plaster and linseed oil met us halfway up and thickened as we rose. On the landing, the inspector paused. "The apprentice found him here," said he. "The room was locked from within. There is no evidence of struggle, no mark of attack. You will see why I hesitate to indulge the imagination of the quarter." Holmes answered only with a small motion of the hand, and the door was opened. I stood in many rooms in which death had preceded us, and each keeps its own character. Some are disordered by it, some appear startled, some seem to deny it still. This room did none of these things. It remained, at first glance, only a painter's studio, large, drafty, crowded with easels, unfinished canvases, brushes in jars, cloths stiff with old color, stools, screens, and shelves, where bottles and pigments stood in ranks of dusty promise. Tall windows admitted a gray and even light which touched everything without favor. In the center of the floor lay the dead man. He had fallen, or perhaps sunk, from his working position with a curious gentleness, one arm extended toward a pallet not far from his hand. His face, though marked already by the grave stillness that no physician mistakes, bore no distortion of terror. The mouth was not clenched, the brows were not violently drawn. There was in the whole posture something almost contemplative, and that, more than any dramatic sign could have done, impressed me with unease. Death had come close. Death had come quietly. The painter himself was older than I had imagined from the name, though not old. His hair was touched with gray at the temples. There remained upon his cuffs and fingers the stains of his labor, as though his profession had refused to abandon him, even in the final posture. Near him stood an easel with a canvas in progress. A figure by a window, scarcely more than half emerged from the ground, and yet already possessed of a melancholy grace. Around the room were landscapes, studies, portraits, and those abandoned attempts by which an artist's uncertainty becomes visible to strangers. In one corner, almost merged with the shadow near the wall, stood a young man whose expression at once drew the eye and discouraged it. He was pale from shock or want of sleep. His hands were stained with color that recent washing had not wholly removed. Youth and distress together gave him a vulnerable appearance which might have moved me more freely had not the circumstances compelled caution. This, I understood without introduction, was the apprentice. Holmes crossed the room with the swift and noiseless economy of movement that comes over him in the presence of serious work. He knelt by the body. His fingers touched the wrist, the collar, the hand. He observed the face, then the floor immediately around it, then the position of the stool, then the pallet. I watched him take in seconds, relations that would have escaped me in an hour. Yet nothing in his manner suggested haste. It was as though every object yielded its place to him in turn. "Well?" said the inspector after a pause. "Well," Holmes repeated softly, not as an answer but as if testing the weight of the word. He did not continue. Instead, he lifted the dead man's right hand slightly, studied the fingertips, and let it rest again. The inspector, perhaps annoyed by the silence, explained that the door had been secured, the windows latched, no footprints unusual, no missing valuables, no witness to intrusion. The apprentice had returned from an errand and used his key. Everything else, he insisted, was gossip embroidered by a district that preferred tragedy when illness would do. Holmes reached at last for the pallet. It was smeared with several colors, not yet dry, and among them, a blue of unusual depth caught the eye even in that uncertain light. He did not touch the paint directly. He bent his head, inhaled lightly, and turned the board a fraction. "You note an odor." I asked. "A suggestion," said he. "To me, it is merely oil and color," said the inspector. "To you," Holmes replied gently, "it is what you expected to find." The inspector introduced him by name. The lad bowed awkwardly, his lips dry, his eyes hollow with some mixture of grief and dread. Holmes's expression, which can be hard enough when he chooses, softened by a degree. "You found your master in this state?" "Yes, monsieur." "At what hour?" "Just after noon." "And he was alive when you left him?" The youth swallowed and nodded. His English was careful, his voice low. The dead man had been in good spirits. He had sent the apprentice to fetch certain supplies. Nothing in the morning had suggested danger. He had spoken, the boy said, of finishing the figure at the window, and perhaps beginning another work before evening. There had even been, in his mood, something hopeful. It is one of the small sadnesses attending sudden death that the last remembered words of the dead so often concern trivial continuations. Household to be fetched, a meal to be taken, a task to be resumed. We survive with the dignity of our ambitions, yet vanish in the midst of ordinary sentences. "The room is peaceful," I said later on the landing, perhaps more to myself than to him. "Yes," said Holmes, "that is exactly what troubles me." He descended then, without further explanation, leaving behind us the gray studio, the unfinished canvas, and the body of a man who had died in the midst of color, while the quarter outside continued its business of coffee, gossip, bread, and weather, as if nothing in the upper air of that house had altered. "The arrangement is wrong," said he. "In what respect?" "In several, yet let us not be greedy, and attempt all of them at once." He returned shortly after to the studio, and this time invited me to watch not the body, but his own attention. It is one of the privileges of long friendship with a remarkable mind that one may occasionally be taught the edges of its method, even while the center remains inaccessible. Holmes moved first to the working table. There lay tubes of paint, some squeezed recently, others rolled almost flat. He sorted them with a glance, separated 3, set one aside, and asked the inspector from what shop the apprentice had procured supplies that morning. The answer was given. Holmes nodded, as if a very small instrument within the machine had clicked into place. Next he examined the brushes. There were large ones for ground and softer work, narrow ones for detail, one fan brush worn almost to deformity, and 2 sable points of excellent make. He touched the handles, not the bristles. One brush in particular held his eye. It had been used very recently and not cleaned, though every other evidence in the room suggested a man meticulous within the disorder proper to his trade. "Artists often put the handle to the lips while considering," said he casually. The inspector shrugged. He did not know. The apprentice, standing near the door, colored faintly and said that his master sometimes did so, especially when working in silence or when dissatisfied with a passage on the canvas. It was a habit, he added, of no consequence. Holmes gave him a look so swift that it might have been missed by anyone less long accustomed to his face than I. "No consequence," said he. "Few phrases in this world conceal more." He asked then whether the dead man had eaten. There was bread, fruit, a little wine, but nothing unusual. He asked whether the painter was subject to attacks, tremors, weakness of the heart, or any known seizure. The inspector answered in the negative. The apprentice, more timidly, said that his master had been fatigued at times, irritable at others, but not ill in any settled way. Holmes seemed unsurprised. At the easel he stood for some moments before the unfinished canvas. It depicted, in its emerging form, A young woman seated near a window or chapel opening, her head inclined, her hands not yet complete. The light entering behind her had been laid in with a coolness unlike the rest of the room. And in that light appeared again the same uncommon blue as on the palette, though softened, translated, made nearly spiritual by the painter's handling. Holmes examined the strokes around the robe, the underdrawing visible near the shoulder, and one partly corrected area at the hem where an earlier line showed beneath the new paint. He was interrupted, I said. Yes, said Holmes. But not by noise. That reply, though obscure, sent a small chill through me. There are deaths that arrive with such obvious violence that the imagination has little to do. Here, however, the very gentleness of the scene invited all manner of quieter horrors. Holmes, perhaps recognizing this, deliberately lowered the temperature of the inquiry. He spoke for several minutes with the inspector upon indifferent matters, the dead man's reputation, recent exhibitions, rivalries in the quarter, debts, friendships, critics, women, and the precarious economics of the artistic life. The effect was not to distract, but to widen the air around the central fact, to make it easier for the truth to approach from the side. We learned that the dead painter had admirers and enemies in nearly equal measure. Some praised him as original, others found him mannered, repetitive, and overcommitted to particular effects of light and color. He had lately fallen into dispute with a fashionable rival of better means and broader connections, one Antoine Levine, whose success in wealthier circles had sharpened rather than softened his resentment of those he judged authentic. There was also, the inspector admitted with reluctance, a woman frequently associated in gossip with both men, though the nature of her connection to either remained uncertain. Holmes listened, as a man listens to rainfall upon various surfaces, each sound trivial, alone, yet meaningful in accumulation. He did not pursue any name at once. Instead, when the inspector had done, he requested a clean envelope, a penknife, and permission to remove a minute scrapping from the edge of the palette where the blue paint had gathered thickly. This he did with immense care, sealing the sample as if it were a jewel and not a smear of color. "You suspect poison, then," said the inspector. "I suspect utility," Holmes answered. "That is safer." The boy stammered, corrected himself, and at last settled upon an account in which he had gone first to the color merchant. Then, because the day had brightened, into a small park where he had made a sketch before returning to the studio. He had shown this sketch, he said, to his mother at her cafe. She could confirm the hour. Holmes did not accuse him of falsehood, yet I saw at once that the statement had joined itself to his mind, not as an answer, but as a place requiring future pressure. When at last we left the studio for good that afternoon, the inspector accompanied us to the street and asked, with a dryness barely concealed, whether England had yet detected in the dead man's brushes what France had missed in the room entire. Holmes bowed. "Not detected," said he, "only noticed that the room has been too politely arranged for death." The inspector frowned, perhaps thinking himself mocked, but Holmes passed on without elaboration. We walked in silence for some distance. Montmartre had begun to soften toward evening. The cafe windows glowed. Pigeons gathered upon the wet roofs. Somewhere a violin was being played badly, but with feeling. At length I said, "You believe the colors are responsible?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that the most restful objects in a room are often the least innocent. A chair supports, a lamp reveals, a brush obeys. A palette merely holds color, if one wished to move near a man without alarming him. One might choose to come disguised as the thing already in his hand." He then tucked the little envelope deeper into his coat and turned his steps toward the quarter where the apprentice's mother kept her cafe. The case, which had entered through stillness, now advanced through habit. A brush to the lips, a supply errand, a sketch in a park, a room too peaceful, a color too memorable, These were not, taken separately, facts of any grandeur. But I had long since learned that Holmes trusted such minor fidelities of circumstance more than any dramatic declaration. The smallest detail, if it belongs naturally to the truth, will often outlive a great lie. The café of Madame Dubois stood at a street corner where two narrower lanes met and argued with one another over which possessed the poorer paving. Its sign swung a little in the evening draught. Through the window one saw yellow light, bent heads, pipes, cups, and the tired contentment of those who know exactly how much comfort can be expected from a modest room, and ask no more. After the grey restraint of the studio, the place appeared almost tender. Madame Dubois herself received us from behind the counter with a reserve which yielded more quickly to Watsonian manners than to Holmesian precision. Though she respected the latter once she recognized its purpose, she was a widow of substantial figure, dressed simply in black, with eyes that had not forgotten hardship and yet had retained an active kindness toward the world. If her son had inherited his nervous beauty from his father, he had taken his honesty from her, or so I thought at the time. Etienne emerged from the back room, carrying a portfolio held against his chest as though it offered him protection. He had washed again since we had last seen him, but the half-moons of color remained in the ridges of his fingers. Holmes observed this and made no comment. He accepted seats near the stove, declined wine, and began at once, though not harshly, to rebuild the young man's morning hour by hour. The account was repeated. The list of supplies, the walk to the merchant, the purchased colors, the brief stop in a park to sketch, the visit to the café, the coffee, the return to the studio. Madame Dubois confirmed that her son had indeed come in with a small wrapped parcel, and had shown her a drawing made outdoors. She remembered the hour imperfectly, but the sequence clearly. There had been nothing in his demeanor, she said, to suggest panic or guilt. Only the usual impatience of youth and the distracted air common to those who look more closely at trees and buildings than at the people moving among them. Holmes listened, and then asked, with apparent mildness, whether he might see the sketch. Etienne hesitated, only a fraction. Yet Holmes notices fractions the way other men notice doors. He produced the sheet. It was, at first inspection, a competent study. Benches beneath bare branches, the suggestion of a railing. Two dark figures indicated with rapid confidence, and a distance kept airy by economy. I might have praised it and returned it without second thought. Holmes, however, took longer. He held it nearer the lamp, then farther, then half turned it, as if the direction of light mattered. He even drew his lens, though so discreetly that the mother might have mistaken it for absent-mindedness. "A quick hand," said he at last. The boy lowered his eyes. "Too quick," Holmes added. "Speed flatters youth, but it also encourages omission." He folded the sketch, and, with the careless neatness of one accustomed to making possession seem temporary, slipped it into his inner pocket. The mother made some protest. Holmes bowed and assured her it would be returned. Its value to him, he said, lay not in its artistry, but in its timing. That answer, though strictly true, did not explain much. Yet there was something in his manner which convinced her that resistance would only increase the seriousness of the matter. She subsided, though not gladly, to relieve the strain, and perhaps because he had already gained what he wanted. Holmes allowed the conversation to drift toward the dead painter himself. In such digressions, he is often pursuing the very thing he seems to abandon. We learned that Monitor, though erratic, had shown kindness to the boy, and had more than once supplied the mother with money under the pretense of ordering extra coffee for visiting friends. He had critics. He had irregular success. He borrowed, repaid late, worked intensely, and spoke at times as if certain colors mattered to him morally, and not merely professionally. Madame Dubois described these peculiarities with a tenderness that did not belong to romance, but to gratitude. There is a distinct kind of quiet in a small cafe after dusk, when the clatter has peaked and begun to thin. Cups are set down more softly, chairs scrape less often, outside. The weather presses against the panes, but does not enter. One becomes aware of bread crust, damp coats steaming near the stove, and the weary innocence of ordinary trade. The case, which had seemed sharper upstairs in the studio, grew gentler there, as if for a moment all its edges had been laid in cloth. I believe Holmes intended this. Sleep stories, if I may use the phrase, for that slow seduction by which comfort permits the mind to keep listening, often depend not on the absence of danger, but on the repeated return of shelter. Outside, evening had deepened. The street lamps made small pools upon the damp stone. Holmes walked some yards without speaking. Then, touching the pocket in which the sketch lay folded, he said, "The park is not in the park." I stared at him. "That drawing," said I. "What of it?" "It was not made from the scene described." "You are certain?" "Quite. It pretends to rapid observation, but the perspective betrays recollection. More than recollection, familiarity. Our young friend has drawn from memory a place he knows better than he wished to admit." "Whose place?" Holmes did not answer at once. We passed a baker closing his shutters, a flower girl hurrying with her basket under a shawl, two students arguing in voices too earnest for the hour. At length, Holmes said, "A house. A rich one. Not in this quarter." It was said so calmly that the full significance took some moments to settle in me. The apprentice, then, had not merely omitted a detail. He had concealed an association. Yet even then, Holmes did not seem chiefly interested in proving deception. Rather, he appeared to be measuring its scale. Was the boy a conspirator, a messenger, a thief, or only one more nervous creature entangled in someone else's design? As if reading the line of my thoughts, Holmes said, "A falsehood of fear has a different grain from a falsehood of ambition. One must learn which this is." He then altered our course and announced that the next morning we would pay a call upon Monsieur Antoine Lavigne. "Since our dead man had a rival," said he, "we may as well look at the face envy chose to wear when it could afford a better tailor." The servant who admitted us had the neutral face of one who has seen enough vanity to cease being impressed by it. We were shown through a gallery lined with canvases and decorative objects, too carefully distributed to suggest comfort. Wealth, when anxious, arranges itself like evidence for the defense. Holmes glanced at these things, and, as usual, appeared to absorb not only what they were, but what their owner had hoped they would imply. Antoine Lavigne received us in a drawing room, looking upon a winter garden, where the hedges had been clipped into obedience. He was a handsome man, though of the type whose self-knowledge has turned from advantage into occupation. His dress was impeccable. His hair had been arranged with that deliberate care which seeks to appear accidental. He had the controlled ease of a man long applauded, and not yet resigned to the possibility that applause might contain no love. At the mention of the dead painter, his mouth altered by the smallest degree. "Poor Monitor," said he. "Paris is sentimental in loss. It forgives so much more readily once a man is no longer available to disappoint it." I confess the coldness of the sentence offended me. Holmes, however, let it pass. He spoke instead of admiration, rivalry, and the difficult balance between originality and recognition. Lavigne responded fluently. Indeed, he spoke too well. There are those who tell the truth awkwardly, and those who dress lies in rhetoric. Lavigne belonged to a third category, the man who has aestheticized his own resentments until he mistakes polish for innocence. He did not deny that relations between himself and Monitor had been strained. Strain, he suggested, was natural among artists of ambition. One man values discipline, another hides incapacity behind mystique. One man evolves, another repeats himself, and calls repetition fidelity to vision. Holmes listened to these distinctions with an attention almost flattering. I, less patient, saw only that each phrase sought to diminish the dead under cover of discussing art. On a side table near the fireplace stood several jars of medium and small packets of pigment. Though this was evidently not the room in which work was usually done, Holmes drifted toward them while Levine was speaking and lifted one by the label. His movement was courteous, nearly idle, yet I knew by long experience that no casual touch of his is casual at all. He noted, I think, not only the materials themselves, but the fact that they had been left where they could be seen. "Do you bring your work into every chamber?" asked Holmes. Levine smiled. "When one lives by vision, one does not keep it in the attic." A rustle behind us announced the entrance of a young woman. She was dark-haired, pale in the way that follows fatigue rather than illness, and possessed of that grave beauty which does not brighten a room so much as alter the gravity within it. Levine introduced her as Mademoiselle Cécile. Her inclination of the head was composed. Yet I noticed that her eyes moved first to Holmes, then to the door, and only after that to me. Such people are measuring not etiquette but risk. She remained. Only briefly, a few words passed, little more than formalities, and she withdrew. Yet in that short interval, I had the strong sense that the household held more currents than its polished surfaces wished to admit. Levine seemed conscious of her presence, even after she had gone. His remarks became more theatrical, his disdain more finely sharpened, as if he were performing not for us alone, but for some invisible tribunal of taste. Holmes led the conversation gradually toward the dead painter's habits. Did Monitor buy his own colors? Did he favor any particular supplier? Was he careless? Impressionable? Proud? Superstitious? Levine laughed softly and said the man's greatest superstition was color itself. There was, he told us, one blue to which Monitor had returned with near religious stubbornness, as if all transcendence in art lay imprisoned in that shade. It amused Levine, or so he claimed, to see a grown man pursue a single tone with such devotional anxiety. That remark, delivered lightly, had upon Holmes the effect of a small bell sounded in another room. No one unfamiliar with him would have noticed it. I did. The pupils sharpened, the shoulders seemed to settle a degree lower. Nothing in his face announced discovery, yet something had been placed exactly where he needed it. We remained some minutes longer. Levine supplied anecdotes, all of them clever and none of them kind. Holmes responded with enough interest to keep the current flowing, though he offered little of himself. As we took our leave, a servant appeared with gloves and cane, and in that ordinary motion, my attention was caught by a brief exchange at the far end of the hall. Cécile, descending as if by chance, let a folded note slip toward the man's hand. The gesture was swift, practiced, and accompanied by a look which flickered almost involuntarily in our direction. Once in the carriage I remarked upon it. "My dear Watson," said Holmes, "what would become of me if you neglected all visible irregularities?" Then you saw it. I saw enough to know that this house contains more silence than peace. He drew from his pocket Etienne's sketch and opened it upon his knee. Under the carriage lamp I saw more clearly than before that the supposed park study was indeed something else. The broad line that I had taken for railing was wrought iron of expensive design. The vertical mass behind the tree shapes could easily be a facade. The perspective had the memorized certainty of a place repeatedly glimpsed from within or from the same approach. "Levine's house," I said at last. Holmes folded the sheet again. "Or one extraordinarily like it, Holmes, perhaps following some similar line," said quietly. "When mediocrity discovers that charm and success will not compensate for originality, it often turns chemist." Chemist? He only tapped the pocket where the pigment sample rested and looked out at the passing trees. The case was changing shape. What had begun as a still room and a dead painter now admitted motive of a subtler kind. Not robbery, not sudden anger, but the cold wish to see another man's vision weakened, discredited, perhaps replaced. And if that wish had indeed found a practical instrument in paint itself, then the beautiful things in both studio and mansion had become, for Holmes, no longer decorations of the case, but its language. Cecile received us with visible reluctance, yet not surprise. I inferred from this that some warning had either reached her or been expected by her since our visit to the mansion. Holmes did not force confidence upon her. He sat opposite with that air of detached attention which has often persuaded reluctant witnesses that the simplest truth is safer than a graceful defense. "You knew both men well?" he asked. "As well as a model may know the painters who require her to sit still," she answered. The reply was guarded, but weariness had already entered it. She went on to say that in Montmartre one does not choose one's associations by purity. Work comes where it comes, a face, a posture, a pair of hands, the line of a neck in profile. These may be rented by one artist, and then another until the woman herself becomes to the quarter less a person than a recurring arrangement of light. There was no self-pity in the statement, if anything. She seemed too tired for it, little by little, and under no pressure more visible than the quiet persistence of Holmes's eye. She admitted that rivalry between Monitor and Levine had grown bitter in recent months. Levine mocked what he called the other man's obsessions, chief among them a devotion to a certain blue which he found pretentious and monotonous. Monitor, by contrast, defended the color as if it were not a mere material, but a state of the soul. He had spoken to her, she said, of skies before rain, of saints' robes in old glass, of distance upon water, of the hour just before evening when sorrow becomes bearable, because the light turns it gentle. In that blue he believed there was peace without death, and sadness without despair. Holmes heard this without visible sentiment, yet the content struck him deeply. Practical men are not so practical as they appear. They simply reserve their emotions for structure. Here, I think, he perceived that the color was no incidental preference, but a signature of mind. If a crime had indeed passed through pigment, then the victim's most intimate artistic loyalty might have provided the route. Cecile also told us, after a pause, that Levine's mockery had not been confined to conversation. He had studied Monitor's work obsessively, criticized it publicly, imitated passages of it in private, and once, in her hearing, declared that the public was too ignorant to distinguish authenticity from improved imitation. The phrase remained with me, for it carried that unpleasant mixture of admiration and contempt which so often precedes treachery. "Did Monitor fear him?" asked Holmes. "Not exactly," she said. "He despised him in the way a man despises someone who understands his methods but not his reasons." That answer pleased Holmes more than any direct accusation would have done. It suggested a relation intimate enough for danger and cold enough for design. He then inquired with studied negligence whether Monitor permitted others into the studio freely. "Sometimes," said she, "friends, pupils, dealers, critics. More often, the apprentice, occasionally, by arrangement. A servant or porter with materials." Holmes asked whether Levine himself had visited lately. She hesitated before saying not that she knew. The pause was more valuable than the words. When at last we rose, Holmes advised her, with a gravity almost paternal, to speak of our conversation to no one in Levine's household. Her expression altered then for the first time, from caution to fear. It was quickly mastered, yet enough remained to confirm that she understood perfectly the sort of risk we had named only by implication. We left the cafe and walked without haste through streets where evening had begun to gather in the shop windows. Flower sellers were packing their stems in damp paper. A child dragged a toy by a string. Somewhere bread was being taken from an oven. and the smell drifted warm and human through the coal. Holmes's silence lasted until we had turned twice and entered a quieter stretch of road lined with bare trees. "The blue," said he at last. "Yes, it is now no longer a color but a pathway." I waited. If monitor was attached to one pigment above others, then any manipulation involving that pigment would pass under less suspicion than one involving his general materials. Men are least wary where habit has already laid the hand. "You think the poison, if poison there was bound to that particular color. I think our toxicologist will tell us whether art may be made to deliver chemistry by the mouth." We dined modestly, and later he walked me by a circuitous route back toward our hotel, choosing quieter streets where the city seemed to exhale. There is a peculiar mercy in Paris at night when one avoids its grander avenues. The lamps along narrower roads cast less spectacle and more companionship. Laundry lines become invisible. Upper windows shine like thoughts not yet spoken. One hears a piano in the distance and cannot tell whether the player is practiced or merely persistent. In such surroundings, even a case darkened by envy and possible murder may pass for a little while into contemplation. Before retiring, Holmes opened once more the envelope containing his scraping of blue paint. He did not touch it, only looked at it under the lamp. A man may be ruined by the thing he loves most in his own work, said he quietly. That has a tragic symmetry criminal minds are often too coarse to appreciate, and therefore all the more pleased to exploit. The next morning, we went to the laboratory of a noted toxicologist. The case had moved, by then, from suspicion into a form of waiting. If the palate held poison, all our observations would align. If it did not, then the room's strange civility around death would require some entirely different explanation. Either way, the truth now stood closer than before, and I had the distinct sensation of a curtain lifting not with drama, but with the soft inevitability of daylight. Dr. Lefebvre was a spare gentleman with patient hands, and a face sharpened by concentration rather than temperament. Holmes presented the sealed sample and explained, in the driest terms, that it had been removed from the palette of a painter found dead under circumstances not yet clarified. The doctor asked no melodramatic question. He merely inclined his head, prepared his dishes and reagents, and began. There is something curiously soothing in competent scientific work when one is not oneself responsible for the result. The movements are small, exact, and free of vanity. Drops fall. Powders dissolve. Glass lightly taps glass. A flame is adjusted. A notation is made. Holmes watched with an intensity nearly motionless. I occupied myself with the room, then with the doctor's hands, then with Holmes's profile, while the city beyond the window continued in ignorance of the answer being distilled from a trace of blue. At length, the doctor straightened. "It is paint," said he. But not only paint. Holmes did not move. A toxic alkaloid has been introduced into the medium. Most skillfully mixed with oil, its presence might go unnoticed unless one expected irregularity. Taken into the system gradually, it would not strike at once. There could be numbness first, then weakness, then collapse. "What substance?" asked Holmes. The doctor named a plant known among physicians and poisoners alike for its virulence. In English, one might call it monkshood or wolfsbane. The amount necessary to destroy, when properly administered, is not great. Bound with color, the doctor explained. It could cling to the fingers, the brush handle, perhaps even the lips if the artist had a habit of touching tools there while working. Small exposure might produce nothing decisive. Repeated exposure, or one carelessly concentrated application, would do the rest. I confess I felt then a deeper horror than any knife wound would have occasioned. There is, in poison, something particularly intimate. It enters under cover of trust. It asks the body to admit what it would reject if honestly named. Here, moreover, the means had been joined to vocation. The dead man had not merely been murdered, he had been betrayed by the very practice through which he gave form to his thoughts. Holmes thanked the doctor and asked 2 or 3 questions concerning timing, symptom progression, and whether an untrained person might mistake the effect for natural seizure. The answers were discouragingly favorable to the criminal. Yes, it might appear uncertain in onset. Yes, if the victim were alone. Yes, if those around him had reason to believe him overworked or unwell. Holmes accepted this without visible satisfaction. The better the method, the narrower the suspect pool. Yet, narrow is not the same as simple. Outside again, in the pale afternoon, I said. Then it was murder. It was design, said Holmes. Murder follows. You are not surprised, only confirmed. He walked a few steps in silence, then, note, Watson, the elegance of the thing. No blow, no intrusion, no need to remain present. Only patience, access, and knowledge of a habit. Such crimes are born less of passion than of contempt. The perpetrator believes himself entitled to shape another man's end, as if correcting a flaw in composition. The line stayed with me because it seemed to move beyond law into morality, where Holmes, despite his reputation for coolness, often arrives sooner than others. We continued toward the river, taking no direct route. I think he wished his mind to have room enough for the new certainty to settle without forcing immediate conclusions upon it. Along the embankment, the air was colder, barges moved slowly. The water carried reflections not of beauty, but of persistence. Paris, seen from there, appeared less theatrical and more honest. Holmes reviewed aloud the pieces now in hand. A dead artist with no wound, a particular blue of special significance, a rival who mocked that attachment while evidently understanding it, an apprentice whose alibi contained concealment, and a household from which secret notes were passed. To this was now added the toxicological fact. The palate had been made deadly by intelligence, not accident. And yet, said I, knowledge of the poison does not alone prove which hand used it. Just so, means without motive is a recipe, not a case. We require the appetite behind it. That appetite began to take shape the next morning in a place far removed from the poor room where the painter died. Holmes woke me earlier than courtesy would have dictated and announced that our destination was the museum. I supposed at first that he intended some comparison of technique, perhaps to educate my untrained eye in the victim's true handling of the blue he so revered. Holmes smiled at this in part. But museums, my dear fellow, are where ambition goes when it wishes to become permanent. If our man desired not merely to inconvenience his rival, but to profit from his weakening or death, then we must look where names are bought, displayed, and believed. The great galleries, when entered early, possess a hush unlike any church, because the devotion there is divided between beauty and value. One hears footsteps, fabric, murmurs of attendants, and the almost physical silence of paintings waiting to be misread by strangers. Holmes moved through the rooms with more haste than reverence, though not without the eye of one who knows what mastery costs. He stopped before a recently hung canvas attributed to Monitor. It represented a young woman at prayer near a source of cool light. The handling was skillful, the effect, at a glance, persuasive, yet before I had done admiring it, Holmes had begun to point. Not theatrically, but with minute, accumulating certainty to hesitations in the brushwork. Heaviness in passages that should have breathed, and, above all, to the blue. There again, said he, barely above a whisper, but wrong, too conscious of itself, not a devotion, an imitation of a devotion. When we left the museum, the case had acquired its deeper motive. Murder alone would have satisfied malice, but discrediting a rival, weakening his hand, then replacing his true work with profitable imitation that required envy refined by commerce. Holmes's expression as we crossed the courtyard was not triumphant. It was cold. Levine, he said softly, has not merely desired the man's absence. He has desired occupancy. The word was exact. To occupy another's place, another's market, another's legacy, another's very signature. Such was the appetite now before us. And once seen, it altered everything behind it. The mockery, the blue, the concealed movements of servants and pupils, the uneasy model, the too carefully civilized room. We were no longer looking only for the hand that had added poison to paint. We were tracing the larger design in which artistic fraud and personal destruction had been composed together, layer by layer, like a picture intended to hold at a distance and betray upon an approach. The following afternoon, we were admitted again to Levine's house, though not to Levine himself. He had, we were told, gone out unexpectedly. In his place there appeared the butler who had before handed gloves at the door, a thin, anxious man, with the air of one whose duties had long ago outrun his principles. Holmes requested a word in private. The man hesitated, saw perhaps in the inspector's card, which Holmes now displayed more authority than was healthy to defy, and led us into a smaller room near the back of the house. Holmes began without menace. He has no need of it. He stated merely that the painter's death had been caused by poison introduced into his palate, that access to the studio had been gained by an intermediary, and that certain movements between this house and Montmartre had already been traced. The butler's face altered with each clause, not dramatically, but with the gradual defeat of blood leaving the skin. "I know nothing of poison, monsieur," he said. "Not yet," said Holmes. The man's hands twitched. A person can defend a lie for only so long as it remains singular. Once the truth has entered the room in several directions at once, the effort of arrangement becomes too great. Holmes pressed no harder than was necessary. He named the day on which the dead painter had received new materials. He mentioned a vial. He referred, almost casually, to the possibility that the servant had been assured of harmlessness. At that, the fellow closed his eyes. What followed was not a full confession, but the first collapse of one. Yes, he had carried a small substance by his master's instruction. Yes, he had once or twice entered the studio under pretext connected with deliveries, and had been shown where certain pigments were kept. Yes, he had mixed the contents of the vial into one color on the palette, but he had been told so. He insisted with desperate eagerness that it would merely weaken the other painter's hand, blur his confidence, expose his failing powers. It was to be a humiliation, not a death. Holmes heard this to the end, and then regarded him with such unblinking concentration that the man seemed to shrink in his chair. "You were lied to," said Holmes, "or you are lying to me now on behalf of the one who lied first." The servant began to protest. Holmes cut him short with a motion almost weary. "The poison used is not the sort a knowledgeable man confuses with a harmless irritant. Your master knew what he employed. Whether you knew is another matter. But do not insult us with a halfway innocence. Servitude does not absolve reason." The man then broke not into courage, but into frightened fragments. He had obeyed too often, asked too little, carried notes, conveyed parcels, kept certain visitors waiting and others admitted. He had seen enough to fear his master, and too much to leave. Such households produce moral fatigue, the way damp cellars produce mold. I pitied him without trusting him. When we left, Holmes's expression remained severe. "You do not believe he expected no death?" I said, "I believe he expected precisely as much truth as would allow him to obey. Men often choose ignorance in measured doses. It preserves self-respect while cooperating with evil. If the servant's statement narrowed the route by which poison had traveled, It still left unresolved the role of the apprentice. Holmes therefore proposed that we revisit the studio once more, this time not as observers of a room, but as readers of a withheld life. We found Etienne alone among the canvases. The shutters partly open so that a late pale light entered and rested upon dust, wood, and stretched linen. Without the body, the studio felt larger and sadder. Death had withdrawn, leaving only interruption behind. Holmes produced the sketch. "This is not a park," said he. The boy's face drained. "It is a house, one you know." A silence followed so complete that even the street sounds below seemed far away. Then Holmes named the district, not the house itself. The district, it was enough. Etienne began to tremble in the manner of one who has reached the end, not of concealment, but of stamina. The portfolio slid from his hands to the floor. What he confessed then came in bursts, broken by shame. Lavigne had drawn him into dependence some months before, through knowledge of a foolish debt, and certain letters which, if shown, would have injured his mother's reputation, and perhaps ruined the cafe. Under this pressure, the boy had carried information from the studio. Unfinished ideas, compositional studies, habits of work, rumors of sales, even the details of which colors his master ordered in what quantities. He had entered Lavigne's house more than once. He had made drawings there while waiting. But he had never, he swore, tampered with the palette. He had feared only exposure and disgrace, not murder. Holmes listened to him to the end. There was sternness in his face, yet not cruelty. The distinction between weakness and wickedness matters deeply to him, though he does not always advertise the fact. "You have betrayed," said he, "but not in the final degree." The boy wept then, with the exhausted helplessness of youth, discovering how little room remains between fear and complicity, once one has taken the first wrong step. I confess the sight moved me. Had Holmes denounced him in that moment, the lad might have collapsed into permanent ruin. Instead, Holmes told him plainly that his chance of preserving honor now lay in complete cooperation. Nothing concealed, nothing softened, nothing deferred. When we stepped out into the fading light of evening, the quarter seemed to receive us again into its ordinary melancholy. A woman shook a cloth from a window. A painter in a soft hat crossed the street carrying canvases under one arm. A cart of vegetables rolled by with absurd domesticity. After the confessions, the ordinary world felt almost medicinal. "The structure is complete," said Holmes at last. "Only the public arrangement remains. You mean to gather them all?" "Yes, Lavigne, the inspector, the servant, the boy, if necessary. The evidence belongs to more than one voice now, and he must hear them together." He did not say more, yet I knew from the quality of his silence that the climax of the affair was near. It would not, however, be a loud climax. Sleep and truth are alike in this. They arrive most surely when not shouted at. Holmes intended, I think, not a melodramatic exposure, but a controlled unveiling in which each element would settle into place until denial itself became ungainly. Lavigne alone attempted ease. He reclined rather than sat, one hand upon the arm of the chair, the other adjusting a cuff, as if the inconvenience of our gathering concerned him more than its purpose. "You choose dramatic settings, Monsieur Holmes," said he. "Is this to be an inquiry or an entertainment?" Holmes, who never performs when performance is expected, ignored the provocation. Upon a table before the fire he arranged, with almost ceremonial simplicity, 3 objects: a wrapped canvas, the sealed report of Dr. Lefebvre, and the apprentice's sketch. Last of all, he placed there the painter's palette, carefully preserved. The sight of it, with its hardened smears and one darkened blue still visible along the edge, altered the room more than any accusation could have done. "The dead had entered by means of an object I prefer," said Holmes. to let the materials speak first. People are inclined to embellish, he began with the palette. The medical conclusion was stated plainly. Poison had been mixed into the paint medium, not enough to declare itself by odor to the casual observer, but enough to destroy a man who repeatedly handled his brushes in a habitual way. Marot, whose skepticism had by then given way to professional seriousness, confirmed the scientific finding. Levine smiled faintly and said that painters work with dangerous substances every day. If one romantic insists on licking his brushes like a schoolboy, is that murder or stupidity? An interesting distinction, said Holmes, especially from one who understood exactly which color the victim used most intimately, and how. He then turned to the wrapped canvas and uncovered the forged picture from the museum. Even those untrained in such matters could perceive, when Holmes placed beside it a small authentic study borrowed for comparison, that the counterfeit possessed labor where the original had breath. Holmes did not belabor the artistic points. He needed only enough to show motive. Here was a false Monitor, prepared for circulation, while the true Monitor's reputation was under threat from unexplained weakness and death. Levine's expression changed then, not to fear, but to anger. One often sees in guilty men the strange pride of feeling themselves aesthetically misjudged. A forgery? He said, this is connoisseurship turned into slander. Not slander, said Holmes. Commerce. He moved then to the sketch. Etienne could scarcely bear to look at it. Holmes explained how the drawing, presented as a rapid scene from a public park, in fact, retained structural memory of Levine's own residence, and therefore demonstrated the apprentice's concealed visits. Under pressure, and for reasons tied to his mother's safety and finances, the boy had indeed supplied information from Monitor's studio. This was his shame, and must remain so, but it was not the final crime. Levine sprang up at that, seizing on the confession like a gambler on a last card. There, said he, your own witness is a spy and thief. If poison was used, why not by him? Youth envies as readily as age. Etienne made a broken sound. Holmes raised a hand without looking at him. Because, said he, the boy feared exposure, not artistic eclipse. Because the route of the poison passed through a servant under your authority. Because the chosen color corresponded to a private knowledge of the victim's habits, which you mocked openly and studied secretly. Because the counterfeit in the museum reveals your appetite not for revenge alone, but for replacement. And because every person here, when placed properly within the pattern, points not outward, but toward you. He then called upon the butler, who, deprived of all room for maneuver, repeated in fuller form the account of the vial, the instructions, the access to the studio, and the assurances given by his master that the substance would merely impair the rival's powers. Holmes listened, then fixed Levine with a gaze so level and piercing that even I, who was not its object, felt its force. You chose, said he, a poison too exact to be mistaken by an intelligent man engaged in materials. You chose a method intimate enough to seem fate. You chose a servant compromised enough to obey and credulous enough to preserve your self-image. You chose a pupil already trapped by fear, from whom to learn the victim's habits and current work. And while this was unfolding, you prepared a false picture under the dead man's name. That is not impulse, Monsieur Levine. It is composition. There followed a silence in which the rain against the windows became suddenly audible. Cécile closed her eyes. Marot did not move. The officers near the door had the stillness of men who know that a room has crossed from conversation into consequence. Levine's resistance did not collapse all at once. He attempted first wit, then contempt, then an injured appeal to the vulgarity of the accusation. But Holmes had deprived him of theatrical room. Each gesture found no air around it. Each phrase returned against the weight of object, testimony, and motive. At last, something in him altered. The elegance remained, but the conviction behind it failed. "I meant to expose him," he said, in a voice lower than before. "To weaken him, to show what he truly was once deprived of his tricks. If death followed, Holmes repeated. Levine's face tightened. He was already decaying. "You all worship originality as if it were innocence. He stole from light itself and called it revelation. The public would never have known the difference. I only hastened what decline had begun." There, in that moment, the final truth of him emerged more clearly than any confession of mechanics could have done. He did not merely excuse the crime. He justified occupancy. To him, another man's gift was a territory improperly held. Holmes's answer was cold and clean. "No, monsieur. You did not hasten decline. You manufactured it. Then, finding death the more efficient ally, you moved to inherit the appearance of what you could never originate." Marat stepped forward then, and the officers with him. Levine did not struggle. Pride often remains after courage has failed. He offered his wrists not with resignation, but with the last posture of a man, determined to present arrest itself as a misunderstanding of his refinement. Yet as they led him away, I saw what no posture could hide: the complete ruin of someone who had arranged his whole identity around superiority, and found himself reduced at last to mode. After the door had closed behind them, the room exhaled. Etienne sank into a chair and covered his face. The butler wept in the dry, shocked manner of a servant whose soul has suddenly remembered it belongs to a person. Cecile stood very still, as though motion might return the whole scene to existence. Holmes gathered the objects from the table one by one, not possessively, but with that practical tenderness he extends to evidence once it has completed its task. "A bitter case," I said, when at last we were alone enough to speak. "A common one in uncommon dress," Holmes replied. "Envy seldom wishes merely to injure. It wishes to occupy. We left the mansion beneath a rain no heavier than before. Yet the city felt changed because the pattern within it had been named. The broad street shone. A carriage rolled by and vanished. Somewhere a clock struck. Paris, having yielded up one of its quieter crimes, resumed at once its immense indifference. Such is the mercy and insult of great cities. They preserve no pause proportionate to the sufferings within them. A forgery, said he, is an attempt to steal admiration. Murder, in such a case, is only the removal of the witness best qualified to object. That sentence remained with me long after. It explained not only Levine, but a species of crime more modern and perhaps more civilized than crude violence, yet no less cruel for its polish. And as we turned at last toward our lodging, the rain thinning into mist, the case seemed to recede already from danger into sadness, which is often the truer afterlife of solved things. Our return to London was made under weather so similar to that which had first greeted the telegram that it seemed, upon stepping from the train at Charing Cross, as if England had preserved for us the exact mood in which we had left it. The same patient drizzle lay upon the streets. The same gray intelligence moved through the sky without brightness. Cabs passed with wet wheels and tired horses. Porters shouted into the damp, and yet beneath the familiarity there remained in me that peculiar sense, common after foreign inquiries, that one has not truly come back at all, but only brought another city's shadows folded within the coat. Holmes bore the journey with outward equanimity. He had purchased in Paris a small monograph on historical pigments and read from it at interval, though I doubt he absorbed much beyond the comfort of technical language. There are cases which, once solved, leave him instantly free. Others linger because their logic is complete, while their human residue remains untidy. This affair belonged to the latter kind. He had little patience for self-conscious reflection, yet I could see that Levine's form of crime, so polished, so parasitic, so certain that imitation entitled itself to inheritance, had lodged in his thoughts. As for me, my mind turned less to the criminal than to those caught around him. The dead painter whose gift had made possible both admiration and hatred, the apprentice who had taken the first wrong step in fear and nearly followed it into destruction, the servant who had obeyed in installments of conscience, and the weary woman whose face had been borrowed by men ambitious enough to mistake possession for understanding. Solved cases do not close over all their lives at once. The law secures one figure and leaves the rest to time. Mrs. Hudson received us with that combination of relief and reproach which belongs only to long-standing domestic loyalty. She lamented our meals abroad, our exposure to weather, Holmes's probable neglect of sleep, and the state of our luggage, all in one continuous stream. Holmes accepted the whole with vague gratitude and immediate distraction, pausing only long enough to warm his hands at the fire, before drifting toward his chemical apparatus, as naturally as a migratory creature returning to its customary branch. How strange and consoling our sitting room appeared after Paris, the violin upon the chair, the Persian slipper for tobacco, the correspondence piled against impatience, the old stains upon the mantel from experiments. No house ought to forgive these things, reasserted not order exactly, but continuity. One returns from the subtler dramas of the world to discover that the true luxury of home lies not in comfort alone, but in repeated arrangement. A familiar chair may calm the mind more deeply than a solved problem. Holmes changed into his dressing gown, and before I had even fully unpacked, set water heating for some inquiry into metallic salts, which had no bearing whatever on France. "You cannot mean to work tonight," I said. "My dear Watson," he replied, "if the mind is not given a fresh corridor to walk, it will return too often to the last room." This was as near an admission of disturbance as I was likely to receive. I left him to his glassware and seated myself at the desk with pen, paper, and the first stirrings of that obligation which has so often compelled me to record our adventures before time can thin them into anecdote. Yet for some moments I did not write. The rain touched the window, the fire settled. Holmes moved quietly among his retorts. All the violence of the affair, being of the refined and indirect sort, had left behind not agitation, but a kind of bruised stillness. At length Holmes spoke without turning. "You see, Watson, envy is rarely content to remain envious. Left alone, it becomes interpretive, then corrective, then entitled, finally destructive. You think Levine hated the man himself less than what the man represented? Precisely. True talent insults those who possess every accessory of success, except necessity. Levine could imitate effects, he could court opinion, he could furnish rooms, influence dealers, charm the wavering, and perhaps even persuade himself, but he could not bear the existence of someone whose relation to beauty was inward rather than strategic. Such men often begin by mocking what they cannot generate. If permitted, they end by arranging its absence. I asked whether he considered Etienne redeemable. Holmes, adjusting a flame, answered after a pause. "Yes, because shame reached him before self-justification did. That is often the dividing line." The remark was characteristic. Holmes has little tenderness for weakness, yet an exact respect for the moment at which conscience either returns or dies. In the apprentice, he had seen not innocence, but recoverability. In the servant, he had seen moral fatigue. In Levine, never once had he seen remorse, only the gradual collapse of aesthetic arrogance under contradiction. The rain deepened for a while, and then softened again. London, in such weather, seems made less of brick than of memory. I finally began to write, not at once the crime and its mechanics, nor the poison, nor the forged picture in the museum, but the room in Baker Street on the morning the telegram came. I have learned that atmosphere is not ornament in a case, It is often the truest form of entry. One cannot understand a mystery only by cataloging facts. One must also remember the light under which those facts first became visible. As I wrote, the Paris affair changed in character, removed from immediate danger. It lost the sharpness of investigation and became instead a long inward picture. The gray studio, the unfinished figure by the window, the fatal blue, the poor cafe with warmth in its cups, the rich house with poison in its courtesies, the museum wall bearing false admiration, the rain on the avenue after the arrest. Cases live twice, once in action, and once in recollection, and I sometimes think the second life is the more revealing. Near midnight, Holmes abandoned chemistry long enough to draw his violin from its chair and play not brilliantly, not even with a full tune in mind, but in those wandering phrases by which he often lets thought dissipate itself into sound. The notes moved quietly through the room, touching the corners of it more softly than speech. Outside, the rain kept time in another register. If there was sadness in the music, it was of the sort that does not ask to be cured, only acknowledged. When he ceased, he looked over with the faintest trace of amusement. Will you give the matter a title? I had thought of calling it The Affair of the Poisoned Palette. A little literary, said he. Then perhaps The Case of the Poisoned Palette. That will do. It leaves the colors to the imagination. He returned to the violin, and for a time we sat without speaking. There are silences between old friends that do not signify absence, but completion. The fire lowered itself. Mrs. Hudson, moving somewhere below, secured the house for night. Baker Street resumed its long companionship with darkness and weather, but endings of that neat sort are seldom the deepest endings. The truer conclusion, at least for me, lies elsewhere. It lies in the thought that beauty, which ought to elevate the spirit, may also excite in certain natures the most corrosive forms of hunger. It lies in the knowledge that the objects nearest to a man's gift may be turned against him by those who study the mechanism without sharing the devotion. And it lies, too, in the quieter comfort that truth, though often slower than deception and less fashionable in its first appearance, possesses a greater endurance. Even now, when rain touches the Baker Street windows in just that fine, indistinct way, and the fire breathes rather than burns, I can recall with peculiar clarity the palette on the table in Levine's salon, and the way Holmes arranged it there among the other proofs. A simple object, wood, dried paint, thumbhole, worn by use, yet in it were gathered affection, habit, labor, signature, method, betrayal, and death. Few things in this world are as innocent as they appear when long familiarity has protected them from attention. Hush,